to tell the business that you cannot or should not engage this supplier or do this service because we don't have the right contractual terms in place, I'd be thrown out of the room, right? You just have to find ways to move at the speed of business.
Mm-hmm.
So it's friction and velocity. So there's still a focus on savings. There's still a focus on risk mitigation, but there's a very strong overlay to reduce friction and increase velocity.
I'm Hal Marcus.
And I'm Memme and Hal.
And this is Meeting of the Minds, the legal AI podcast from Evisort.
We interview lawyers, professors, and legal operations pioneers that are pushing the envelope.
Leaders using technology to drive great business outcomes and shape the future of the profession.
Hey, Hal. I'm excited to dive in today. We're doing something a little bit different this month, especially when it comes to the persona of who we're speaking with.
Exactly. This is not someone in legal or legal operations. This is someone who is a real expert in procurement. So much of the value that we see from contract management comes from working with procurement professionals, getting value out of vendor contracts, reducing risk in vendor contracts. And we talked to somebody really knowledgeable about that today.
And I've worked with hundreds of companies, especially at the strategic enterprise level, and the relationships between legal and procurement can vary so much, but the constant is it's important to get right if you want to have effective contracting.
It is, and that is one of the topics that we got into with Harold Wu, Chief Procurement Officer from Rowe Price. So he gets into his background, but I just got to share something that we didn't get into in the podcast that people should know, because we did a webinar not long ago with Harold as well. And what we learned there was in his 5+ years at Rowe Price, they've now achieved savings of $20 to $40 million per year in procurement.
Awesome. Well, I'm excited to dive in today. Without further ado, let's go.
Harold Wu, thanks so much for joining us today on Meeting of the Minds.
Well, thank you for inviting me. It's my pleasure to be here.
So could you walk through your background a bit, how you came to the role that you're in, and a little bit about what the focus and the range of your role is?
Sure. So I'm the Chief Procurement Officer for Rowe Price. It's an asset management company headquartered in Baltimore. Rowe has been in business for 87 years. We were founded in Baltimore, and we're not the largest asset management company, but I believe we have among the most stellar reputations in the asset management business. I've been their Chief Procurement Officer for about 5.5 years. I was hired to transform the procurement function. And procurement at Rowe, there is, if you will, the core procurement functions of sourcing and procurement operations, but as well, I have a supplier management, so third-party risk, supplier performance management, and outsourcing as it relates to our outsourcing providers. So Rowe, we buy about $1 billion of goods and services. It's all what we call in the industry indirect spend. So we don't buy raw materials or have direct supply chain concerns, but we buy goods and services that would support a financial services company. Before Rowe, I worked for CIBC for 15 years and then Bank of Montreal for about 10 years. So I've been in the procurement business for almost 3 decades.
A lot of people naturally see the domain of contracts within legal. Could you talk a bit about the importance of reading and understanding agreements for folks in the procurement role?
So it's interesting, the deliverables that procurement provides to the organization is a signed contract. But a contract has legal terms, which is rightfully the purview of the legal team, but it has commercial terms, which is in the purview of procurement. So while it's one document, you read it and are concerned about different things that you see in a contract. So while the lawyers will look at the legal T's and C's from a risk allocation and ensuring the liability provisions are appropriate or the indemnity provisions have been considered and privacy considerations are in the contract, procurement people will look at it in terms of what's the commercial terms on the fees. Is it a contingency arrangement? Is it a deliverables-based arrangement? There prompt pay discounts? Are there penalties for lack of service? We look at KPIs and SLA. So anyway, it's the same document, but it's through different lenses.
So please be honest, is all of that artful legal language then just a barrier or frustration? Wouldn't you ideally love a contract to just be a list of bullets?
No, because the reality is to enable our commercial terms and to have our commercial terms take effect and have impact, we need the foundation and the enabling language that the lawyers provide us. And you can't do one without the other. I mean, there's no point having a contract with purely legal terms because ultimately it's a legal arrangement and a commercial arrangement.
That's very interesting because since the advent of generative AI, we hear so much interest in summarization of legal terms and the explanation of legal terms in much plainer language that can be readily understood across lots of departments, put into action much more effectively than the convoluted language of a drawn-out indemnity provision. And yet you're saying, no, we really do need that. We need that language that everyone can agree on, that has all of the commas in the right place and all that. That's an interesting perspective. I'm surprised.
So I'm a chief procurement officer. I'm not a lawyer. And I rely on the legal advice that they have legal training, they have legal precedents, they have laws and regulations that have to be interpreted. And I rely on them to determine what the appropriate enforceable legal language is. Now, the summaries and the making it understandable, I don't think you should confuse that with what the legal drafting should be. And again, I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not suggesting the language should be different.
Yeah.
One is a summary or a layman's version so that I and others can understand it. But to ensure that it's enforceable in the laws and in the courts, that's in the domain of the lawyers. And I don't have a point of view on what that language should be.
Interesting.
Yeah. And looking deeper into that back and forth, the almost dance between legal and procurement, in my engagements with global organizations, I've seen it done so many different ways. Maybe legal does negotiations, maybe procurement does negotiations, maybe one of them owns the contract moving forward, maybe both of them, maybe neither of them, maybe it's the business unit itself that the document was for. Any best practices you've seen in having procurement and legal work well together?
Yep. So having been in this business for almost 30 years, I clearly have a point of view on this. And the best practices I've seen, actually, let me tell you, when people ask me, what do I see as the role of procurement? I relay this, and this is extreme, so please don't take it literally, but I think it makes the point.
Good thing no one's recording this.
When you're looking at a supplier contract, there are typically three players. There are the lawyers, there are the business people, and there is procurement. When a business person looks at a supplier contract, they want to sign it today, right now, because the supplier is someone I need to work with to enable my business deliverables. Of course, they're trustworthy. Of course, they're my best friend. Of course, we just need to get on with life because we just need to do the business of what it is the business wants. So they will sign the contract right away. You take the lawyers at the other end, and the lawyers need to dissect every word and every phrase. They need to look at not just the second or third contingency. They have to look at the risk allocation. They need to look at case law. They have to look at precedents. And if you give them 5 years, they will take 5 years to assess the supplier contract.
Especially on the billable hour.
Yes. What procurement does is we bridge that gap. We bridge that gap between the impetuousness of the businesses to sign anything that's put in front of them and the overly cautious legal point of view. And we bridge that gap so that, in fact, we can get a contract that is done in a timely manner and addresses the business needs, addresses the legal concern. So coming back to your question about best practices, in the organizations that I've worked in, there is a clear recognition at the enterprise level that the business is the business owner. And from a risk acceptance point of view, if we're going off risk standards, the businesses have to accept it, having gotten appropriate advice from the professionals, whether it's legal, procurement, technology, or HR. The lawyers have accountability for the legal T's and C's, but not the commercial terms, and procurement negotiates the commercial terms. So we are clear about the areas of responsibility. We're clear about who is best at, the lawyers are best at lawyering, the business is the best at running their business, and procurement is the best at bridging those two divides and negotiating the commercial terms.
Wow. And one more question, though, about this kind of back and forth between legal and procurement that happens every time a deal is done. And it's a question of, what have you seen around actually ownership of that document moving forward? Because oftentimes there might be different systems that these two teams live in. Procurement might want to go back in the future and find out, what did we do? Legal might want to know that. And the business unit themselves that's affected by this contract might want to know. What have you seen historically about what works and doesn't work about having that single source of truth, or potentially multiple?
So again, a best practice that I've established in every organization that I've been in is having that on the buy side, on the contract side, establishing a single source of truth for supplier contracts. That procurement, obviously, we use on a daily basis. The lawyers have access to it, and select business partners. We don't typically open it up to all business partners because, if there are 26 amendments, they don't typically have the patience to look at Amendment 26 to see the trail of changes that's happened over time. So we have a central repository, and then the things like Evisort and how we want to use it is, in fact, to unleash the insights from our contracts for those three communities, for the legal community, for the procurement community, and for the business. Again, we may have different reasons that we might want to look at it. In procurement, we would want to look at early pay discounts, or we might be interested in cost of living increases, or we might be interested in the fee arrangement, what form of fee arrangement it is. The lawyers might want to look at liability structures and where we have unlimited liability or capped liability, etc. And the business wants to know, what are the KPIs and SLAs? So again, we all have a need to get in a timely, efficient manner those insights, but we can come at that same document from different ways. And that's where a tool like Evisort helps all of us.
Well, that's great to hear. And is standardization of those terms really important? Because one of the elements that I hear a lot, we can pull this information out, but if we can't get it normalized to the point that across thousands and thousands of contracts, we can see the same data points depicted in a graph, in a bar chart, in a calendaring tool so that we have alerts and updates and that sort of thing. If we can't get that information that may appear differently in different contracts, if we can't get it normalized into standard data terms, then our hands are a little bit tied about what we can do with it at scale.
So a couple points on this question. So every company, unless you are a Google or a Microsoft, we all have to sign vendor paper. So it isn't as if chief procurement officers, we propose our templates, but typically in Tiro's case, about half of our paper is vendor paper. So it is not standardized. similar contents, but it's in different places. And the language is different because it's not our template. So if you think you will go to page 76 of every contract and you will find the insurance provisions, that is not the case. So that's the first thing. It's not easily found unless you have a tool. And then to your point, to be able to find, identify, for example, the insurance provisions in our contracts, and we all have interests in what the insurance provisions are, whether they conform to our standards, whether the certificates of insurance have been provided, whether it gives us the right coverage or not. We need that standardization or the ability to pull that out and compare it, in our case, across the 30,000 supplier contracts that's in our repository. And again, that's what a tool like Evisort gives us the ability to do.
I'm curious, before using a tool like Evisort for AI, what was the process of tracking some of these important data points? And did you have to leave some by the wayside? I'm always interested in kind of what it looked like in the past, especially in procurement, where it's less, large clause language, but more numbers and dates that are the data points you're interested in.
So our e-procurement system that we use for source to pay is Coupa. And our repository is in Coupa. And when you establish your contracts in Coupa, you have about 15 or 20 metadata fields that when you enter it into the repository, you can establish. So it's who's the contracting party, what's the effective date, what's the expiry date, who's the business owner, which state or country laws are the governing law. So you get to pick about 15 or 20 of them. If you have a query beyond that, it's assuming it's in Word, you use Word and try to do a search for insurance or indemnity and you see what comes up. So it's ad hoc, it's manual, and it's time consuming, right? That's the current world. One of the benefits of having an AI or a generative AI tool is the natural language query and the ability on one contract or multiple contracts to not quite instantaneous, but in a much more efficient manner and a much more complete and thorough way, able to query and again, get those insights out of our contracts.
And I'm curious because I know there's been a lot of legislation in the last few years around third-party risk management and really knowing your vendors and really knowing all these things about them. Has that heightened kind of the need to have this visibility into vendor agreements?
A real-world example, recently with the involvement of Russia in the Ukraine war, the State Department, or I don't know which government body, said, you shall not, if you will, do business with Russia or get services. And so the question came to procurement, which suppliers are providing us services from Russia? And we scratched our head and said, oh, good question. And so we had to prioritize because we don't have the tools to easily do it for 30,000 contracts. So we had to take our tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 suppliers, the top 2,000 suppliers, and do a manual search of the word Russia to see what came up. And in fact, we had developers, people that were developing code in Russia. And we had to obviously take actions for it. So GDPR was another one that when GDPR came up, there's a new legislation in Europe called DORA, D-O-R-A, that again, same thing. They're not one-offs. We have to be able to identify the contracts that need to be modified to incorporate the new regulations that are coming into place.
And what's that interaction like with legal when those changes occur? Is it legal coming to you and saying we need to initiate this process? Is legal taking the lead on any of that? Just generally speaking, I'm not so much trying to dig into the world of T. Rowe, but rather, how do you see that playing out in your experience and the interaction of the teams?
It's a joint partnership. So legal will be aware of the regulation. They will assess the impact. They will come to us and say, can you help us identify which contracts and which suppliers are affected. We provide that list to them. They come up with proposed legal language and they give it to procurement, and then they say, we want procurement. You go off and negotiate those terms with the suppliers. So legal does the sort of backroom assessment, drafting of the revisions, but they do not negotiate those terms with the providers. So we go off, and then if the revisions that are being proposed are, quote, legal T's and C's, then it's a joint negotiation between procurement and legal at the table between Tiro and the supplier. But that's how it works. It's not an either or. It's a collaboration.
Looking beyond compliance, I'm curious about financial arrangements, volume discounts, rebates, things like that. Do you get strong initiatives from the C-suite or elsewhere, KPIs, et cetera, around cost reduction? I mean, obviously you must with the amount of budget you're overseeing. And what role do contractual terms play in that kind of initiative?
Big time. The mandate of most procurement organizations are twofold. It's save money and minimize risk. That's simply put. I mean, you could put a lot of words around it, but that's what it holds.
I'm in marketing. I put lots of words around it.
Yes. So definitely there is a focus on commercial terms that, whether it's volume discounts, payment based on milestones, the ability to have penalties or service credits for lack of delivery, any of those commercial terms, there is a lot of focus on it. And one of the things, because we have so many contracts, often we negotiate these terms, but there is no tracking or follow-up. Did we get the volume discount, especially with our consulting companies? So we spend, like many financial services companies, large dollars with consulting firms. And we typically have a tiered fee structure that when you hit a certain dollar threshold, you get a volume discount. But first of all, you have to know what those thresholds are. And then two, you have to follow up on whether you're getting it. And unless you have the tools to be able to do that, you are leaving money on the table.
So all those commercial terms that you care so much about, how do you track these things? Do you have your playbook? Do you have a way of putting all that together for a set of guidance?
The short answer is currently no. We don't have a knowledge base, if you will, that captures it. It's really one of expertise and experience, sort of word of mouth or handing it down. But part of the vision that we have for using a tool, a contracts analytic tool like Evisort is, certainly we have use cases that we'd like to, those are just table stakes in terms of use cases. The next phase will be building a closed library for procurement, because I talked earlier about the division of labor between legal and procurement. And in our organization, T. Rowe Price, and at the banks that I came from, the division, our target is 80-20. 80% procurement will have carriage off, 20% legal will have carriage off for the most high value, high risk contracts, because that's where the expertise lies. So we will build a closed library for procurement's use to deal with that 80% volume. But the next step in that vision is building, in fact, if you will, a commercial library. This is where, through analyzing our contracts repository, we can document the deal structures and the best practices associated with commercial terms. We don't have that today. It's really a word of mouth kind of experience thing. And I think if we're able to harvest the contract intelligence and history that's embedded in our contracts, it can make a procurement organization much more efficient and effective. But we're not there yet. That's not the first use case, but that is where we are. Part of my vision anyway, in terms of where we want to go.
I think that's incredible. And honestly, a lot of what you've been talking about, the importance of some of these data points, something we say all the time is, you're always tracking X amount of things in your contracts. We always need X plus one.
Right.
There's always that additional thing you're going to need to know. And I'm curious because you just went through a very thorough vetting of different tools. And when you were looking at different AI powered tools and doing proof of concepts and pilots, et cetera, how did you test to confirm that the tool you landed on wasn't just setting you up for success today, but for those eventual X+1s and additional data points that your team may want to track down the line?
Yeah, happy to fill you in there. So yeah, anything that T. Rowe Price does, we do it quite deliberately and comprehensively. So we ran 5 proof of concepts with 5 different sort of the leaders in the AI space. And just as we have background, the reason we did this was I report into the chief financial officer, and she came to me and said, Harold, we go through a budgeting exercise every year, and for spend in general, I understand the drivers of cost. But for supplier spend, I typically use a 3% inflation when it was 3%. I know there was a time it was higher, but I typically use a 3% increase. But I don't have any data that says that in fact is correct. Can you tell me from your repository of supplier contracts, do I have an exposure? Does the firm have an exposure with my working assumption that I should allow for 3% inflation increase in supplier contracts? So I said to her, good question.
You sound like a lawyer when you say that. Can I just call that out? All you have to do is follow it up with, it depends.
Yeah, no, it must depend. This is black and white. The contract says there's but I didn't know. So we didn't have the tools. So we hired a small army of people to manually go in. And again, we had to prioritize the number of contracts, and we got an answer that said mostly she was right, but we had some outliers that she had to provide for. So we had a manual answer. And then we said, we wonder if there's some AI tools, since we know what the answer should be. And that was our proof of concept. The business question that our CFO asked around inflation increases. And so we tested the tools to see how accurate the responses that they got, how easy it was to use, what the user interface was, whether we could do it ourselves or we had to be handheld by the supplier, and how our assessment of if the tool could grow with us, as I talked about my vision earlier, how it could grow with us. And hands down from that assessment, it was a unanimous choice by the people doing the POC that Evisort was the number one choice. I should also say, in parallel, but I didn't know about it, the legal department was conducting an assessment. In their case, they needed or wanted a repository as well as a contract analytics tool. And in parallel, but separate from what we were doing, they went through their assessment and also picked Evisort to be their repository, in their case, 85,000 sell-side contracts, and for the contract analytics. So, in fact, happily, like any large organization, the right hand doesn't always know what the left hand is doing. In this case, it happily came together that the procurement organization, the legal and compliance organization settled on the same tool for our contracts analytics.
Hard, let's take a little bit of a step back. How has procurement evolved or changed over the years? Any big shifts that you've noticed? Or are the key focuses, like you said before, of make business happen faster, save money, it still reign paramount, and really it's just the tools that have changed?
So it's savings and risk, but the important overlay in the last few years, and maybe it was always there as an undercurrent, but it's gotten more prominence. I talk about it in my organization. It's about friction and velocity. Friction in terms of the ease of engaging with procurement, the ease of getting contracts done between legal, procurement, and the business. And decision makers and business owners don't have a lot of patience if we put them through hoops and our processes and our asks are not efficient and effective. So that's the friction side. There are many, many dimensions to it. How they pay invoices, whether it's the use of P cards or corporate cards rather than two-way or three-way matches. And do we need invoices? And anyway, so there's a lot of dimensions to the friction piece. The velocity piece, especially with the speed of the changes and the expectations that we all have as consumers and how quickly Amazon and others can get things to you the same day. The velocity piece is they want shared services organizations like procurement to work at the speed of business, to tell the business that you cannot or should not engage this supplier or do this service because we don't have the right contractual terms in place. I'd be thrown out of the room. Right? You just have to find ways to move at the speed of business. So it's friction and velocity. So there's still a focus on savings. There's still a focus on risk mitigation, but there's a very strong overlay to reduce friction and increase velocity.
Excellent. And before closing, do you have any pieces of advice, especially with a lot of our listeners being on the legal side of the house, any pieces of advice for legal leaders who might be having trouble working collaboratively and effectively with their respective procurement counterparts?
Yeah. Communications and clarity of roles and an acceptance and acknowledgement of what expertise the various groups have and what they bring to the table, right? I'm sure lawyers are, as I say, good at lawyering or excellent at lawyering.
Are you sure?
They would say they are. But are they necessarily the best at negotiating commercial terms? Because commercial terms are not black and white. I'm not suggesting legal terms are black and white, but they can be because there's a whole foundation to it. Commercial terms and negotiations of commercial terms is about give and take, about balances, and it's not black and white. It's at best gray. And not that lawyers aren't good at that, but it takes a different mindset to do that. And I would suggest that negotiators of commercial terms that sit in procurement are probably better suited to do that. So the discussion to your question, I would say have discussions with the legal and procurement team. If you can come to clarity, as we have at T. Rowe Price, and we did at the Canadian banks that I worked at, in terms of what is your area of expertise, what is your area of responsibility, and just divide the work appropriately.
Savings and risk,
Right.
friction and velocity,
Yes.
communication and clarity.
Yes.
I have
You summarized it even better
I have-
than I did.
Those are your summaries. I have my strategic initiatives for future interactions on this front. That was a fantastic summary.
Thank you.
Harold Wu, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Meeting of the Minds, the Legal AI podcast, is brought to you by Evisort. To learn more about Evisort and how we can help you contract better with AI, visit Evisort, EVISORT.com.
You can find Meeting of the Minds on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you listen to podcasts. Don't forget to click subscribe so you won't miss future episodes.
On behalf of everyone here at Evisort, thanks for tuning in.